Aldrics Steady Gaze. Paris, 1919. Elizabeth Garrison had always kept a war photograph of Major Nathaniel Blackwood beside her bed. But tonight, his face wasn't where it should be. He had turned just slightly, just enough to look directly at her. Chapter 1. The photograph that refused to stay the same. The Parisian rain fell softly, a melancholic counterpoint to the jazz spilling from a nearby cafe. Elizabeth Garrison traced the outline of the silver frame, her fingertip lingering on the glass. Inside, Major Nathaniel Blackwood stood stiffly, a ghost captured in sepia tones, a relic of a war that was supposed to be over, a war that, in her heart, raged on. He was in uniform, the harsh lines of his jaw softened by the grainy quality of the image, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the camera's lens, beyond the carnage of the trenches, perhaps dreaming of a future he wasn't sure he'd have. Or so it had always been. Tonight, however, was different. Elizabeth blinked, the gaslight flickering, casting dancing shadows across the small room she rented above a boulangerie on the Rue Claire. The aroma of baking bread, a constant, comforting presence, usually soothed her frayed nerves. Tonight, it did nothing. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. No, she wasn't imagining it. Major Nathaniel Blackwood, the man she had loved with a fierce, desperate love born in the chaos of a field hospital in Amiens, the man who had carried her heart away with him to the front lines, the man who had died at the Somme, was looking at her. Not at some distant horizon, not at a future that had been cruelly snatched away, but directly at her. His eyes, usually flat and lifeless in the photograph, held a depth, a spark of something. Recognition? Longing? Or was it merely a trick of the light, a cruel jest played by her grief-addled mind? She'd kept this photograph beside her bed for the past year, since the news had arrived, delivered with brutal efficiency by a grim-faced officer who smelled faintly of chlorine and regret. A year of mourning, of trying to piece together a life shattered by loss, of navigating the treacherous currents of post-war Paris, a city celebrating its survival while haunted by the specters of its dead. A year of clinging to this image, the last tangible link to the man who had shown her that even in the darkest of times, love could bloom, fragile and defiant, like a poppy in a shell crater. Elizabeth had been a nurse, a volunteer, barely out of girlhood when she'd arrived in France. Naive, idealistic, she believed in the noble cause, in the power of healing, in the promise of a brighter future. The war had stripped away those illusions, layer by layer, leaving her raw and exposed. Nathaniel had been her anchor, her solace, her forbidden secret. A major, she a mere nurse, their love a transgression against the rigid rules of military hierarchy, a flame flickering dangerously in the winds of war. Their stolen moments, snatched between air raids and the endless stream of wounded, had been precious, sacred. Whispered conversations in the dimly lit corners of the hospital tent, the briefest of touches, hands brushing as they passed instruments, the shared silences that spoke volumes. He told her stories of his home in Cornwall, of the rugged coastline and the crashing waves, of a life she could barely imagine, a life so far removed from the mud and blood and despair of the front. He'd promised her a future, a cottage by the sea, a life filled with peace and laughter. She'd clung to that promise, even as the telegram arrived, its stark words obliterating her world. Major Nathaniel Blackwood. Killed in action.
Some.
July 1st, 1916. The date was etched into her memory, a permanent scar on her soul. She pulled back from the photograph, her hand trembling. The room felt colder, the jazz music jarring, the scent of bread suddenly cloying. Had she finally succumbed to the madness that whispered at the edges of her sanity? Was this the final unraveling, the inevitable consequence of holding on too tightly to a ghost? She closed her eyes, willing herself to calm down, to find some semblance of the rational, practical woman she had once been. It was the rain, she told herself, the flickering gaslight, the exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. She was seeing things, imagining things, projecting her longing onto a lifeless piece of paper. But when she opened her eyes, he was still looking at her. This time, there was no mistaking it. The subtle shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible tilt of his head, the intensity in his eyes, it was undeniably there. It was as if the photograph, a static moment frozen in time, had somehow changed. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the edge of the nightstand, her knuckles white. This was impossible. Photographs didn't change. Dead men didn't stare out from their frames with eyes that seemed to burn with a life that had been extinguished. She reached out again, her fingertip tracing the outline of his face, the curve of his jaw, the slight upward turn of his lips, a ghost of a smile that she remembered so vividly. The glass was cold beneath her touch, but his eyes felt warm. Suddenly, a sharp rap at the door shattered the silence. Elizabeth jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly placed the photograph face down on the nightstand, her hand still shaking. "Mademoiselle Garrison?" A voice called out, muffled by the thick wooden door. It was Monsieur Dubois, the owner of the boulangerie, his voice tinged with concern. "Are you all right, mademoiselle? I heard a noise." Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "Oui, Monsieur Dubois," she called back, her voice surprisingly steady. "I just dropped something."
"I'm fine."
A pause. "Are you sure, mademoiselle?"
"You sound distressed."
"Yes, quite sure," she insisted. "Thank you for your concern." She heard him hesitate, then his footsteps receded down the hallway. Elizabeth sank back onto the bed, her gaze drawn back to the photograph. She slowly turned it over, her fingers trembling. Nathaniel was back in his original pose, staring out at that distant, unseen horizon. The spark in his eyes was gone, replaced by the familiar, lifeless gaze. She was losing her mind. But even as she told herself that, a tiny seed of doubt, of hope, of something she couldn't quite name, had been planted in her heart. A seed that whispered, however faintly, that perhaps, just perhaps, the impossible was happening. And that the man she had loved, the man she had lost, was not as far away as she believed. The rain continued its mournful rhythm against the window pane, a soundtrack to a mystery she was no longer sure she wanted to solve, but knew she had to. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parisian Twilight. The following day dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the turmoil in Elizabeth's heart. The memory of the photograph, of Nathaniel's altered gaze, clung to her like the damp Parisian air. She moved through her morning routine mechanically, the familiar rituals of brewing tea and slicing bread providing a fragile sense of normalcy in a world that felt increasingly unhinged. She worked as a translator at the American hospital, her fluency in French and English a valuable asset in the post-war chaos. The hospital, still overflowing with wounded soldiers and shell-shocked veterans, was a constant reminder of the war's enduring scars. The faces she saw, etched with pain and loss, mirrored her own internal landscape. She tried to focus on her work, on the endless stream of medical reports and patient charts, but Nathaniel's face, his changed expression, kept intruding. Was it a hallucination, a symptom of her grief? Or was it something more, something inexplicable? During her lunch break, she ventured out into the Tuileries garden, seeking a moment of respite from the hospital's oppressive atmosphere. The gardens, usually a vibrant tapestry of color and life, were muted today, the gray sky casting a somber pall over the manicured lawns and flower beds. She found a secluded bench beneath a weeping willow, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a faint whisper, a voice carried on the wind. It was so faint she almost dismissed it as her imagination, but then she heard it again, clearer this time. It was a man's voice, speaking in English, with a faint Cornish accent that sent a shiver down her spine. Elizabeth, she looked around, her heart pounding. The gardens were sparsely populated, a few elderly men reading newspapers, a couple of young mothers pushing prams, a scattering of soldiers in various stages of recovery. None of them seemed to be paying any attention to her. None of them could have spoken her name. She closed her eyes, willing herself to hear it again, to confirm that she wasn't imagining things. The wind rustled through the willow branches, And again she heard it, the faintest whisper, but undeniably there. "Elizabeth, don't give up." The words were barely audible, but they resonated deep within her soul. It was Nathaniel's voice. She was sure of it. The accent, the timbre, the way he said her name, with a tenderness that had always melted her heart. She opened her eyes, her gaze scanning the gardens, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one there. No one who could have spoken those words. A wave of despair washed over her. She was losing her grip on reality. She was hearing things, seeing things, conjuring up ghosts from the depths of her grief. But then she noticed something. A small, white feather, lying on the ground near her feet. It was a dove's feather, pristine and untouched, as if it had just fallen from the sky. Elizabeth picked it up, her fingers tracing its delicate structure.
Doves.
Nathaniel had loved doves. He told her stories of the dovecots at his family home in Cornwall, of the birds' gentle cooing and their unwavering loyalty. He'd said they were symbols of peace, of hope, of enduring love. She clutched the feather tightly in her hand, a sudden surge of determination coursing through her veins. She wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to succumb to despair. She was going to find out what was happening, even if it meant confronting her own sanity. She returned to the hospital, her mind racing. She needed to talk to someone who might understand, someone who wouldn't dismiss her as a madwoman. She thought of Dr. Dubois, a kind, elderly psychiatrist who worked at the hospital. He had a reputation for being unconventional, for exploring the mysteries of the human mind with an open and compassionate heart. She had spoken to him a few times, confided in him about her grief, her struggles to cope with Nathaniel's death. He had listened patiently, offering words of comfort and support. She found him in his office, a small, cluttered room filled with books and papers. He looked up from his work, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice gentle. "What brings you here?" She hesitated, unsure how to begin. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice trembling. "Something strange." She told him everything about the photograph, about Nathaniel's changed expression, about the whispers in the garden, about the dove's feather. She poured out her fears, her doubts, her desperate hope that she wasn't losing her mind. Dr. Dubois listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He didn't interrupt her, didn't dismiss her, didn't judge her. When she had finished, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on hers. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I believe you." Her eyes widened in surprise. You do?" "Yes," he said. "I believe that you are experiencing something extraordinary. Something that defies rational explanation." He explained that he had encountered similar cases before, instances of people who had experienced inexplicable phenomena, often connected to loved ones who had passed away. He spoke of the power of grief, of the enduring bonds of love, of the mysteries of the human consciousness that science had yet to fully understand. "The mind is a powerful thing, Elizabeth," he said. "It can create its own reality, especially in times of extreme stress or trauma. But it can also be a conduit to other realms, other dimensions, perhaps even other times." He suggested that she keep a journal to document her experiences, to try to make sense of what was happening. He also recommended that she visit a certain Madame Evangeline, a spiritualist who lived in Montmartre. "She is a woman of unusual gifts," he said. "She may be able to help you understand what is happening, to connect with whatever is trying to reach you." Elizabeth was hesitant. She had always been skeptical of such things, of mediums and seances and the occult. But she was desperate. She was willing to try anything, to explore any possibility, if it meant finding out the truth about Nathaniel. As she left Dr. Dubois's office, a sense of cautious hope began to flicker within her. She didn't know what awaited her, what mysteries she would uncover, but she knew she wasn't alone. And she knew she wouldn't rest until she had found the answers she sought, answers that lay hidden in the whispers of the Parisian twilight, in the shadows of a love that refused to die. The scent of rain-soaked earth and distant wood smoke from a fire she couldn't see filled her nostrils, a peculiar combination that, for a fleeting moment, felt like home. Chapter 3. The ghost of Armistice Day. The next day was Armistice Day. Paris, a city still recovering from the wounds of war, pulsed with a strange mixture of celebration and sorrow. Flags flew, bands played, and crowds thronged the streets, but beneath the surface gaiety, a current of grief ran deep. Elizabeth felt it keenly, the collective mourning of a nation, amplified by her own personal loss. She decided to visit the Place de la Concorde, where a large memorial service was being held. The square was a sea of faces, a kaleidoscope of uniforms, medals, and mourning veils. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of prayers. As the service progressed, Elizabeth felt a growing sense of unease. The speeches, the hymns, the solemn pronouncements of peace, they all felt hollow, meaningless, in the face of her own private turmoil. The photograph, tucked safely in her handbag, felt heavy, a tangible reminder of the mystery that consumed her. She found herself scanning the crowd, her eyes searching for something. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she felt an almost irresistible urge to find it. A face, a sign, a clue, anything that might shed light on Nathaniel's spectral presence. Suddenly, she saw him. Or, at least, she thought she saw him. Standing near the obelisk, partially obscured by a group of soldiers, was a man who bore a striking resemblance to Nathaniel. He was tall, with the same broad shoulders and dark hair, the same military bearing. He was wearing a British officer's uniform, but it was different from the one in the photograph, older, more worn. Elizabeth's heart leaped into her throat. She pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes fixed on the man. He was talking to another officer, his back to her, but she could see the familiar curve of his neck, the way he held his head. "Nathaniel?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper above the din of the crowd. The man didn't turn. She called out again, louder this time. "Nathaniel, is that you?" Still, he didn't respond. She was close enough now to see his profile, and her heart sank. It wasn't him. The resemblance was uncanny, but it wasn't Nathaniel. This man was older, his face lined with a weariness that Nathaniel, even in the midst of war, had never possessed. She felt a wave of disappointment, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. She had been so sure, so convinced that she had found him. As she turned away, dejected, she heard a voice behind her. "Looking for someone, mademoiselle?" It was a different man, a French officer with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to hold a deep understanding. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair and a distinguished bearing. Elizabeth hesitated, unsure whether to confide in him. But there was something in his eyes, a warmth and compassion, that drew her in. "I thought I saw someone I knew," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone who died in the war." The officer nodded, his expression sympathetic.
"It happens," he said.
"The war left many ghosts. Sometimes we see them in the faces of strangers." He paused, then added, "Sometimes they are more than just ghosts." Elizabeth's eyes widened. What do you mean?" He smiled enigmatically. "Paris is a city of secrets, mademoiselle," he said. "A city of hidden pathways and forgotten stories. Sometimes, the past finds a way to return, to reclaim what was lost." He introduced himself as Colonel Dubois, no relation to Dr. Dubois, she quickly ascertained, a retired officer who had served in the French intelligence service during the war. He seemed to know more than he was letting on, his words hinting at a deeper understanding of the mysteries that surrounded her. "If you are truly seeking answers, mademoiselle," he said, "I suggest you be careful. There are forces at play in this city that are not always what they seem. And some secrets are best left buried." His words sent a chill down her spine. But they also strengthened her resolve. She was not going to be deterred. She was going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Colonel Dubois gave her a cryptic smile. "Perhaps our paths will cross again, mademoiselle," he said. "In the meantime, be vigilant. And trust your instincts." He then melted back into the crowd, leaving Elizabeth alone with her thoughts and a growing sense of unease. The memorial service had ended, and the crowd was beginning to disperse. The sky was darkening, and a light rain began to fall. Elizabeth walked slowly back to her room, the colonel's words echoing in her mind. She felt as if she had stepped into a world of shadows and intrigue, a world where the lines between reality and illusion were blurred. As she reached her building, she noticed a figure standing in the doorway, partially hidden by the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the man from the Place de la Concorde, the one who resembled Nathaniel. He stepped forward into the light, and Elizabeth gasped. It was him. Or, rather, it was someone who looked exactly like him, but different. Older, wearier, his eyes filled with a sadness she had never seen in Nathaniel's eyes. But it was undeniably his face. Elizabeth, he said, his voice a low murmur, the Cornish accent unmistakable. She stared at him, speechless, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. I know this is difficult to understand, he said, but I need your help. He didn't say he was Nathaniel. He didn't explain how he was alive, how he had changed. He simply stood there, a ghost materialized from the shadows of Armistice Day, his eyes pleading with her to believe, to trust, to follow him into the unknown. The rain fell harder, washing away the remnants of the day's celebrations, leaving behind a city shrouded in mystery, a city where the dead might walk again. Chapter 4. A Letter from the Somme. Help you? Elizabeth finally managed to say, her voice a shaky whisper. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the impossible reality before her with the years of grief she had endured. This man, this apparition, wore Nathaniel's face, spoke with his voice, yet carried an aura of profound weariness that was alien to the memory she held sacred. He nodded, his gaze intense. There isn't much time. We need to talk, away from prying eyes. He glanced around the street, still damp from the recent rain, the gaslights casting long, distorted shadows. Can we go inside? Elizabeth hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious, to question, to demand answers. But the undeniable familiarity of his features, the echo of the man she had loved in his eyes, overrode her fear. She nodded, fumbling with the key to the Boulangerie's side entrance, the one that led to her small, rented room. Inside, the familiar scent of bread offered a small measure of comfort, a grounding element in this surreal encounter. She lit the gas lamp, its warm glow illuminating the room, highlighting the stark contrast between the worn familiarity of her surroundings and the unsettling presence of this stranger. He stood awkwardly near the door, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the meager furnishings, the worn books, the single, faded photograph on her nightstand, the photograph that had started this impossible journey. He flinched slightly as his eyes landed on it. That picture, he said, his voice strained. You've kept it all this time. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight. It was all I had left of you. He closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing his face. I don't know how to explain this, Elizabeth. I don't fully understand it myself. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with a mixture of desperation and regret. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, but I am not the man you remember. Not entirely. He began to pace the small room, his movements restless, agitated. After the battle, after I was reported dead, things changed. I woke up in a field hospital, weeks later, with no memory of what had happened. They told me I was a miracle, a survivor of a shell blast that should have killed me. He stopped pacing, his hands clenched into fists. But I was different. My memories were fragmented, jumbled. I remembered my name, my rank, my home, but there were gaps, vast stretches of darkness where my life should have been. He looked at Elizabeth, his eyes pleading for understanding. I remembered you, but it was like remembering a dream, a fleeting, ethereal image. I knew I loved you, but I couldn't grasp the details, the moments, the reality of it. He paused, drawing a shaky breath. Then, a few weeks ago, something triggered a memory. A letter I had written to you, just before the battle. It was never sent. It was found among my belongings, returned to me by a sympathetic officer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. The paper was yellowed and fragile, the ink faded, but Elizabeth recognized Nathaniel's handwriting instantly. Her heart ached at the sight of it. The familiar script, a tangible link to the past she thought she had lost forever. He handed her the letter, his hand trembling.
"Read it," he said.
"It might explain things." Elizabeth unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the words, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a love letter, a testament to the deep, passionate bond they had shared. He wrote of his longing for her, of his dreams of a future together, of his unwavering belief in their love. But there was something else in the letter, something that sent a chill down her spine. He wrote of a premonition, a recurring dream he had been having, a dream of darkness, of being trapped, of losing her. He wrote of a feeling of impending doom, a sense that he wouldn't survive the battle. And then, at the very end, he wrote something that made her blood run cold. "If you are reading this, and I am gone, know that I will find a way back to you. Even if it takes a miracle. Even if it means crossing the boundaries of life and death." Elizabeth stared at the letter, her mind reeling. The words seemed to leap off the page, confirming the impossible, validating the surreal reality she was facing. He had somehow, against all odds, returned to her. But how? And why? "The letter," he said, his voice hoarse. "It unlocked something within me. Memories started flooding back, more vivid, more complete. I realized I had to find you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "But there's more, Elizabeth. Something dangerous. Something I don't fully understand. That's why I need your help." He hesitated. "I believe someone or something is trying to prevent me from remembering, from fully returning." The flickering gaslight cast dancing shadows on his face, making him appear even more spectral, more uncertain. He looked at her, a question and a plea in his eyes. Chapter 5. The Scars Beneath the Uniform.
"Prevent you?"
Elizabeth asked, her voice a strained whisper, the letter trembling in her hands. The implications of his words were staggering, hinting at a conspiracy, a force beyond her comprehension. She tried to maintain a semblance of composure, to approach this impossible situation with the same methodical logic she had used as a nurse, but her mind felt like a battlefield, torn between disbelief and a growing, terrifying acceptance. Nathaniel nodded, his jaw tight. "After I received the letter, I started having episodes. Moments of intense clarity, followed by periods of confusion and disorientation. It's as if someone is deliberately interfering with my memories, trying to keep me from piecing together the truth." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered so well, a small detail that grounded her in the face of this overwhelming strangeness. "I've been followed, Elizabeth.
"Watched."
I can feel it. And I've seen things, fleeting glimpses of figures, shadows, that disappear as quickly as they appear." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I don't know who they are or what they want, but I know they're connected to what happened to me at the Somme. To my return." Elizabeth set the letter down on the small table, her mind racing. She had to think clearly, to analyze the situation, to find a logical explanation, even if logic seemed to have abandoned her. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice firm. "Everything you remember, everything you've seen, everything you feel. Don't leave anything out, no matter how insignificant it may seem." He sat down heavily on the edge of her bed, the springs creaking beneath his weight. He looked exhausted, the lines on his face etched deeper by the flickering gaslight. He began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing urgency, as if a dam had broken, releasing a torrent of repressed memories and emotions. He spoke of the field hospital, of waking up in a haze of pain and confusion, of the doctors who told him he was lucky to be alive. He spoke of the fragmented memories, the fleeting images of her, the overwhelming sense of loss. He spoke of the letter, the catalyst that had triggered his return, the catalyst that had also made him a target. He described the episodes, the moments of clarity followed by disorientation, the feeling of being watched, the fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures. He spoke of a recurring symbol, a strange, twisted emblem that he had seen in his dreams, a symbol that seemed to be connected to his tormentors. He couldn't describe it accurately, it shifted and changed, but it always left him with a feeling of intense dread. As he spoke, Elizabeth noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible scar on his left wrist, partially hidden by the cuff of his shirt. It was a thin, white line shaped like a crescent moon. She had never seen it before. "Nathaniel," she said, interrupting him. "Your wrist. What happened there?" He looked down at his wrist, his expression puzzled. I don't know," he said. "I don't remember getting that scar." Elizabeth reached out and gently took his hand, her fingers tracing the outline of the scar. It felt smooth, almost unnatural, as if it had been deliberately created, not the result of an accident. A sudden chill ran down her spine. She remembered Colonel Du Bois's words, "Paris is a city of secrets, some secrets are best left buried." She remembered Madame Evangeline, the spiritualist Dr. Du Bois had recommended. Perhaps it was time to seek her out, to explore the possibility that the answers she sought lay beyond the realm of conventional understanding. "We need to find someone who can help us," she said, her voice determined. "Someone who understands these kinds of things." Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Who?" "A woman named Madame Evangeline," Elizabeth said. "A spiritualist. Dr. Du Bois recommended her." He hesitated, his expression skeptical. "I've never believed in such things," he said. "Ghosts and spirits, it's all nonsense." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I didn't either. But things have changed, Nathaniel. We're dealing with something extraordinary. We need to be open to all possibilities." He looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, at the unwavering belief that had sustained her through years of grief. He saw the woman he had loved, the woman he had fought to return to, and he knew he had to trust her. "All right," he said. "We'll go. We'll see this Madame Evangeline." As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth noticed something else. The photograph on her nightstand. It was face down. She hadn't left it that way. She distinctly remembered placing it upright. She slowly turned it over, her heart pounding in her chest. Nathaniel was looking at her again, but this time his expression was different. It wasn't the longing, hopeful gaze she had seen before. It was a look of warning, of fear, of desperation. The subtle change was unsettling, a silent scream trapped within the confines of the silver frame. Chapter 6. Echoes of a Forgotten Waltz. The journey to Montmartre was a blur of cobbled streets, flickering gaslights, and the ever-present hum of Parisian nightlife. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts and Gauloise cigarettes, a sensory overload that did little to calm Elizabeth's frayed nerves. Nathaniel remained silent beside her, his face etched with a mixture of apprehension and grim determination. The weight of his presence, so familiar yet so strangely altered, was a constant reminder of the impossible reality they were navigating. Madame Evangeline's residence was tucked away on a narrow, winding street, far from the bustling cafes and boisterous crowds of the Place du Tertre. It was a small, unassuming building, its facade covered in ivy, a single, flickering candle illuminating a stained glass window depicting a celestial scene. Elizabeth hesitated before knocking, a sense of unease washing over her. She had always been a woman of science, of logic, of tangible evidence. Stepping into the world of spiritualism felt like crossing a threshold into the unknown, a realm where the rules of reality were bent and broken. But the altered photograph, Nathaniel's fragmented memories, and the chilling warning in his captured gaze had pushed her beyond the boundaries of her rational world. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit hallway. A woman stood silhouetted against the flickering candlelight, her features obscured by shadow. She was dressed in a flowing, dark robe, her silver hair cascading down her shoulders. "You seek answers," she said, her voice a low, melodious hum. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight. We need your help." Madame Evangeline stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The room was small and cluttered, filled with strange objects, crystals, tarot cards, dried herbs, and ancient-looking books. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a heavy, almost intoxicating aroma. "Sit," she said, indicating two chairs facing a small, round table. A single candle burned on the table, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. As they sat down, Elizabeth noticed a gramophone in the corner of the room, a stack of records beside it. A faded label on one of the records caught her eye, Valse Triste. The title triggered a distant memory, a fleeting image of Nathaniel and her, dancing in the dimly lit corner of the hospital tent, a stolen moment of joy amidst the chaos of war. Madame Evangeline closed her eyes, her breathing slow and deliberate. She began to hum, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the room. Then, she spoke, her voice taking on a strange, otherworldly quality. "The veil is thin," she said. "The past is present. The dead are restless." She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on Nathaniel. "You have walked between worlds," she said. "You have crossed a boundary that should not have been crossed." Nathaniel flinched, his expression a mixture of fear and recognition. How do you know?"
"The spirits speak to me," she said.
"They whisper your secrets, your fears, your desires." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers tracing the crescent moon's scar on his wrist. "This mark," she said, "it is a sign, a symbol of the pact you made." "Pact?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. "What pact?" Madame Evangeline turned to her, her eyes piercing. "A pact with forces beyond your comprehension," she said. "A pact made in desperation, in the face of death." She turned back to Nathaniel. "You were given a second chance," she said. "But there is a price to pay. A debt to be collected." She explained that Nathaniel's return was not a natural occurrence, that he had been aided by forces that dwelled in the shadows, forces that sought to control him, to use him for their own purposes. She spoke of a secret society, an ancient order that manipulated the events of the world, that sought to maintain their power through war and chaos. "They are the ones who are interfering with your memories," she said to Nathaniel. "They are the ones who are trying to prevent you from remembering the truth." She revealed that the symbol Nathaniel had been seeing in his dreams was the emblem of this society, a symbol of their power and their control. The crescent moon scar on his wrist was a mark of their ownership, a sign that he was bound to them. As Madame Evangeline spoke, the room grew colder. The candle flame flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The gramophone in the corner suddenly sprang to life, the needle dropping onto the Valse Triste record. The melancholic melody filled the room, a haunting echo of a forgotten dance, a reminder of the love that had been stolen, the future that had been lost. Nathaniel gasped, his eyes widening in recognition. "That music," he whispered. "I remember we danced to that song." Memories flooded back, vivid and intense. He remembered the night before the battle, the stolen moments with Elizabeth, the whispered promises, the desperate hope for a future together. He remembered the feeling of impending doom, the premonition of his own death. But then, the music stopped abruptly. The room plunged into darkness. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candle. Elizabeth heard a scream, a cry of anguish, and then silence. When her eyes adjusted, Nathaniel was slumped in his chair, his face pale, his eyes vacant. Madame Evangeline was gone. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind, carrying with it the chilling echo of a forgotten waltz, and the growing certainty that they were in far greater danger than they had ever imagined. Chapter 7. The Secret of the Jardin du Luxembourg. Elizabeth shook Nathaniel, desperately trying to rouse him. His skin was cold, his pulse weak. He was unresponsive, lost in some deep, inaccessible realm. Panic clawed at her throat. She had to get him out of there, away from the suffocating atmosphere of Madame Evangeline's apartment, away from whatever unseen forces had attacked him. She struggled to lift him, his dead weight a heavy burden. She managed to get him to the door, out into the cool night air. The streets of Montmartre were quieter now, the revelry subdued, the shadows deeper. She half carried, half dragged him towards the nearest taxi stand, her mind racing. She needed to get him to safety, to a place where she could assess his condition, to a place where she could think. She finally found a taxi, its driver eyeing them with suspicion. She gave him the address of her apartment, her voice trembling with urgency. The ride was a blur of flashing lights and jarring bumps, each jolt sending a fresh wave of fear through her. Back in her room, she laid Nathaniel on the bed, his body limp and lifeless. She checked his pulse again, relieved to find it still there, albeit weak and thready. She covered him with a blanket, her hands shaking. She paced the room, trying to make sense of what had happened. Madame Evangeline's words echoed in her mind. A pact, a price to pay, a secret society. It all seemed so fantastical, so unbelievable, yet she couldn't deny the evidence before her eyes. Nathaniel's altered state, the strange scar on his wrist, the chilling events at the spiritualist's apartment. She remembered Colonel Du Bois, the retired intelligence officer she had met at the Armistice Day service. He had hinted at hidden forces, at secrets buried beneath the surface of Parisian society. Perhaps he could help. She needed to find him, to seek his advice, his expertise.
But how?
She had no address, no contact information, only a vague memory of his face and his cryptic words. Then she remembered something. He had mentioned the Jardin du Luxembourg, that he often went there to feed the pigeons. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. She decided to go there, to the gardens, in the morning. She would search for him, ask around, hope that someone might know him. She sat beside Nathaniel, watching over him, her mind filled with worry and uncertainty. She noticed that the photograph on her nightstand was once again face down. She picked it up, her heart pounding. Nathaniel was still looking at her, his expression unchanged from before, the warning, the fear, the desperation still etched in his captured gaze. But now there was something else. A faint glimmer of hope, a flicker of determination, as if he was trying to communicate with her, to tell her something. She stared at the photograph, her mind racing. What was he trying to tell her? What was the secret he was trying to reveal? Then, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small detail, almost imperceptible, in the background of the photograph. A faint reflection in the window behind Nathaniel, a reflection of a building. It was blurry, indistinct, but she recognized it. It was the dome of the Pantheon, a landmark visible from the Jardin du Luxembourg. A sudden surge of hope coursed through her. The photograph was not just a warning, it was a clue. A clue to where she might find answers, to where she might find Colonel Du Bois. It was a long shot, but now she has a direction. She looked at Nathaniel, his face pale and still in the dim light of the room. She whispered a promise to him, a vow to uncover the truth, to break the pact, to free him from whatever forces held him captive. As dawn approached, painting the Parisian sky with hues of gray and pink, Elizabeth prepared to leave. She tucked the photograph into her handbag, a tangible link to the man she loved, a guide to the mysteries that awaited her. She stepped out into the cool morning air, the city slowly awakening around her, and headed towards the Jardin du Luxembourg, a place of beauty and tranquility, a place that held a secret that might save Nathaniel's life, or condemn them both. She walked with purpose, her heart filled with a mixture of dread and determination. The image of the Pantheon's dome, reflected in a dead man's photograph, burned into her memory. Chapter 8. Betrayal in the City of Lights. The Jardin du Luxembourg was bathed in the soft, golden light of early morning. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The gardens were peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Elizabeth's heart. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the faces of the early morning visitors, elderly men reading newspapers on benches, young lovers strolling hand in hand, a few solitary figures feeding the pigeons. She approached a group of men gathered near the Medici fountain, their attention focused on a flock of pigeons pecking at breadcrumbs. She hesitated, unsure how to approach them, how to ask about Colonel Du Bois without revealing too much. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm looking for a man, a retired officer."
Colonel Dubois.
He often comes here to feed the pigeons." The men looked at her, their expressions curious. One of them, an elderly gentleman with a neatly trimmed white beard, spoke up. "Du Bois?"
he said.
"You mean old Henri? He hasn't been here in days." "Not since he trailed off. exchanging a nervous glance with his companions. Not since what? Elizabeth asked, her heart pounding. The man hesitated, then said, not since the incident. What incident? Elizabeth pressed, her voice rising in urgency. The men looked at each other, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and reluctance. Finally, one of them spoke, his voice low. They say he was taken. By the men in black. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. The men in black. She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The man nodded. They came in the night. Took him away. No one knows where. No one dares to ask. Elizabeth's mind raced. The men in black, it had to be the secret society Madame Evangeline had spoken of, the organization that was holding Nathaniel captive, the organization that was interfering with his memories. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had been so close to finding someone who could help her, and now he was gone, taken by the very forces she was trying to fight. But then, she remembered something. Colonel Du Bois had given her a cryptic warning. Be careful, there are forces at play in this city that are not always what they seem. And some secrets are best left buried. He had also said, perhaps our paths will cross again, trust your instincts. Her instincts were telling her that Colonel Du Bois was not gone, that he was still out there, somewhere, that he had anticipated this, that he had left a message, a clue, for her. She looked around the gardens, her eyes searching for something. Anything that might be a sign, a message, a hidden communication. Then she saw it. A small, wooden bench, tucked away beneath a chestnut tree, overlooking the Medici fountain. On the bench, carved into the wood, was a single word, a spoiler. Hope. Elizabeth stared at the word, her heart pounding. It was a message, a sign from Colonel Du Bois. He was telling her not to give up, to keep hope alive. But where was he? What did the message mean? She noticed something else. Beneath the word espoir, there was a small, almost imperceptible scratch, a tiny arrow pointing towards the Pantheon. The Pantheon. The building reflected in the photograph. The building that had led her to the Jardin du Luxembourg. It was more than just a landmark, it was a destination, a meeting point. She knew what she had to do. She had to go to the Pantheon. She had to find Colonel Du Bois, or whatever message he had left for her there. She left the Jardin du Luxembourg, her mind racing. She hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address of the Pantheon. As the taxi sped through the streets of Paris, she felt a growing sense of urgency, of danger, of being caught in a web of intrigue and betrayal. When she arrived at the Pantheon, she found it surrounded by police officers and soldiers. The area was cordoned off, and a crowd of onlookers had gathered, their faces filled with curiosity and concern. She approached one of the officers, her heart pounding. What happened? She asked. Why is the area closed? The officer looked at her, his expression grim.
There's been an incident, he said.
A break-in. Someone tried to steal something from the crypt. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. The crypt. That's where Colonel Du Bois had hidden something, a message, a clue, something that would help her find him, something that would help her save Nathaniel. She knew she had to get inside, to see what had been stolen, to find out what Colonel Du Bois had left for her.
But how?
The area was heavily guarded, and she was just a civilian, a woman with no authority, no credentials. As she stood there, contemplating her options, she saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was Dr. Du Bois, the psychiatrist from the hospital. He saw her too, and his eyes widened in recognition. He approached her, his expression grave. Elizabeth, he said, what are you doing here? She quickly explained everything about Nathaniel, about Madame Evangeline, about Colonel Du Bois, about the break-in at the Pantheon. Dr. Du Bois listened intently, his expression growing increasingly concerned. This is worse than I thought, he said. You've stumbled into something very dangerous, Elizabeth. Something that could cost you your life. He revealed that he knew more about the secret society than he had let on, that he had been secretly investigating them for years, that he had been working with Colonel Du Bois to expose their crimes. He told her that the object stolen from the crypt was a key to unlocking a hidden chamber beneath the Pantheon, a chamber that contained evidence of the society's involvement in the war, evidence that could bring them down. But there was a twist. Dr. Du Bois was not who he seemed. He was a member of the secret society. He had been using Elizabeth, manipulating her, leading her into a trap. The break-in was a ruse, and he had just revealed the truth, to silence her forever. The City of Lights suddenly felt very, very dark. Chapter 9. The Rendezvous at Notre Dame. Elizabeth stared at Dr. Du Bois, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his betrayal. The kind, compassionate psychiatrist, the man she had trusted, the man who had recommended Madame Evangeline, was a member of the very organization that was tormenting Nathaniel, that had taken Colonel Du Bois. It was a devastating blow, a cruel twist of fate that left her feeling utterly alone and vulnerable.
Why?
She managed to ask, her voice trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. Why are you doing this? Dr. Du Bois's expression hardened, the warmth and compassion replaced by a cold, calculating ruthlessness. You know too much, Elizabeth, he said. You were getting too close to the truth. We couldn't risk you exposing us. He signaled to two men standing nearby, men dressed in plain clothes, but with the unmistakable air of authority and menace. Take her, he ordered. The men approached Elizabeth, their intentions clear. She knew she had to escape, to get away from Dr. Du Bois and his henchmen, but she was surrounded, trapped. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air. Leave her alone, Du Bois. It was Colonel Du Bois, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face grim, his eyes blazing with anger. He was not captured. He was not gone. He was here. The men hesitated, turning to look at Colonel Du Bois, their expressions confused. Dr. Du Bois's face paled, his composure momentarily shattered.
Henri? He stammered. But how?
Colonel Du Bois ignored him, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth. Run, Elizabeth, he shouted. Get to Notre Dame, the south transept. I'll meet you there. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She turned and fled, pushing her way through the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Dr. Du Bois shouting orders, the men pursuing her, but she didn't look back. She ran as fast as she could, her only thought to reach Notre Dame, to reach the safety of the cathedral, to reach Colonel Du Bois. She reached the banks of the Seine, the majestic silhouette of Notre Dame looming before her. She crossed the Pont aux Doubles, her lungs burning, her legs aching, the sounds of pursuit fading behind her. She entered the cathedral through a side entrance, the cool, dim interior a welcome respite from the chaos outside. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old stone, the silence broken only by the faint murmur of prayers and the distant echo of footsteps. She made her way to the south transept, her eyes scanning the shadows, searching for Colonel Du Bois. She found him standing near the rose window, its intricate stained glass panels casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the stone floor. He was bruised and battered, his clothes torn, but he was alive. He was there. Elizabeth, he said, his voice relieved. Thank God you're safe. She rushed to him, embracing him, tears streaming down her face. I thought they had taken you, she said. He held her close, his arms strong and reassuring. They tried, he said. But I managed to escape. I knew they would be watching you, that they would use you to get to me. That's why I left the message at the Jardin du Luxembourg. I hoped you would understand. He explained that he had been investigating the secret society for years, that he had discovered their involvement in the war, their manipulation of governments and markets, their ruthless pursuit of power. He had gathered evidence, proof of their crimes, and hidden it in the crypt of the Pantheon, hoping to expose them. But Dr. Du Bois had found out, had betrayed him, had set a trap for him. The break-in had been a ruse, a way to lure Elizabeth, and to retrieve the evidence without raising suspicion. He's one of them, Colonel Du Bois said, his voice filled with disgust. A wolf in sheep's clothing. He used your trust, your vulnerability, to get to me, to get to the evidence. Elizabeth felt a wave of shame and anger wash over her. She had been so naive, so trusting. She had allowed herself to be manipulated, to be used as a pawn in their deadly game. What now? She asked, her voice trembling. What do we do? Colonel Du Bois looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. We fight back, he said. We expose them. We bring them to justice. He revealed that the key stolen from the crypt was not the only way to access the hidden chamber beneath the Pantheon. There was another way, a secret passage, known only to a few. He had learned of it during his years of investigation. He told her that they needed to retrieve the evidence, to expose the society's crimes, to clear Nathaniel's name, to break the pact that held him captive. But it's dangerous, Elizabeth, he warned. They will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Are you sure you're ready for this? Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. She had lost her love, her innocence, her trust. But she had not lost her courage. She had not lost her determination.
I'm ready, she said. I'll do whatever it takes.
As they stood there, in the heart of Notre Dame, beneath the gaze of the saints and angels depicted in the stained glass windows, they made a pact of their own. A pact to fight for justice, to fight for truth, to fight for the love that had been stolen, the future that had been threatened. The cathedral bells began to toll, their solemn resonance filling the air, a call to arms, a call to action, a call to a rendezvous with destiny. Chapter 10. A Promise Etched in Glass. Colonel Du Bois led Elizabeth through the labyrinthine corridors of Notre Dame, navigating the ancient passageways with a familiarity that spoke of his years of clandestine investigations. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, as they descended into the bowels of the cathedral, leaving behind the familiar world of stained glass saints and echoing prayers. He explained that the secret passage to the Pantheon was linked to a network of tunnels that ran beneath Paris, a hidden underworld used for centuries by smugglers, revolutionaries, and secret societies. The entrance to the passage was concealed behind a seemingly ordinary wall in one of the cathedral's crypts. They reached the crypt, a small, dimly lit chamber filled with ancient tombs and sarcophagi. The air was heavy with a scent of dust and decay, a palpable sense of history and mortality pressing down on them. Colonel Du Bois examined the walls, his fingers tracing the contours of the stone. He stopped before a section of wall that seemed no different from the rest, but his touch revealed a subtle difference, a slight indentation, almost imperceptible. He pressed his hand against the indentation, and with a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "The passage to the Pantheon." He lit a small lantern, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the tunnel. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of earth and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. They entered the passage, Colonel Du Bois leading the way, Elizabeth following close behind. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to crouch as they moved forward. The walls were rough and uneven, the floor covered in loose stones and debris. As they progressed, Elizabeth felt a growing sense of unease. The darkness pressed in on her, the silence amplified by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional drip of water. She felt as if they were descending into the heart of darkness, into a world where the rules of reality were suspended, where anything was possible. Colonel Du Bois stopped suddenly, his hand raised in warning. "Listen," he whispered. Elizabeth strained her ears, trying to hear what he had heard. At first, she heard nothing, only the silence of the tunnel. But then she heard it. A faint sound, distant but unmistakable. The sound of voices. "They're down there," Colonel Du Bois whispered. "They must be guarding the entrance to the chamber." He extinguished the lantern, plunging them into complete darkness. He took Elizabeth's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We need to be careful," he said. "We need to get past them without being seen." They moved forward slowly, silently, their senses heightened in the darkness. The voices grew louder, closer. Elizabeth could hear the murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of metal, the scrape of boots on stone. They reached a point in the tunnel where it opened into a larger chamber. Peeking cautiously around the corner, Elizabeth saw them. 3 men, dressed in the same plain clothes as the men who had tried to capture her at the Pantheon. They were standing guard before a large, iron door, their weapons visible in the dim light of a single lantern. The chamber was the hidden room beneath the Pantheon, the room that contained the evidence Colonel Du Bois had gathered, the evidence that could expose the secret society's crimes. We need to find a way to distract them, Colonel Du Bois whispered. Create a diversion. Elizabeth looked around the chamber, her eyes searching for something. Anything that might help them. Then she saw it. A small alcove in the wall, partially hidden by shadows. Inside the alcove, there was a pile of loose stones and rubble. She had an idea. She whispered her plan to Colonel Du Bois. He nodded, his expression grim but approving. They waited for the right moment, timing their actions to the rhythm of the guards' conversation. Then Elizabeth acted. She reached into the alcove and grabbed a handful of stones. With a silent prayer, she hurled them across the chamber, aiming for a spot far from the guards, far from the iron door. The stones clattered against the wall, the sound echoing through the chamber. The guards jumped, startled, their weapons raised. What was that? One of them said, his voice alarmed. Stay here, another said. I'll check it out. One of the guards moved towards the source of the noise, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. This was their chance. Colonel Du Bois moved swiftly, silently, towards the iron door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metal object, a lockpick. He began to work on the lock, his fingers moving with practiced skill. Elizabeth watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. The guard was returning, his suspicions aroused. He was getting closer. Colonel Du Bois continued to work on the lock, his brow furrowed in concentration. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, with a soft click, the lock yielded. The iron door swung open, revealing a dark, narrow passage. Let's go, Colonel Du Bois whispered, grabbing Elizabeth's hand. They slipped through the door, into the passage, just as the guard returned to his post. The guard saw the open door, his eyes widening in alarm. He shouted, alerting his companions. But it was too late. Elizabeth and Colonel Du Bois were gone, vanished into the darkness of the secret chamber, leaving behind the frustrated cries of the guards and the promise of a reckoning, etched not in stone, but in the fragile, flickering hope of a world desperately needing to be set right. The scent of old paper and dust filled the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang they'd smelled earlier, reminding her of a library, not a hidden vault of secrets. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom. The secret chamber was smaller than Elizabeth had expected, barely more than a cramped cell. Dust motes danced in the single beam of Colonel Du Bois's relit lantern, illuminating shelves crammed with files, documents, and ledgers. The air was thick with the musty smell of aged paper and decay, a silent testament to years of carefully guarded secrets. This is it, Colonel Du Bois said, his voice hushed with a mixture of triumph and grim satisfaction. The evidence that will bring them down. He began to sift through the files, his eyes scanning the documents, his fingers tracing the faded ink. He pulled out a particular folder, its cover marked with a single, ominous symbol, the twisted emblem Nathaniel had described, the mark of the secret society. This is what we need, he said, handing the folder to Elizabeth. This contains proof of their involvement in the war, their manipulation of governments, their war profiteering. It's all here. Elizabeth opened the folder, her heart pounding. The documents inside were written in a complex code, a cipher used by the society to conceal their communications. But there were also photographs, grainy images of men in uniform, of meetings in darkened rooms, of weapons shipments, of clandestine operations. One photograph in particular caught her eye. It was a picture of a group of men, standing around a table, their faces obscured by shadow. But one man was clearly visible, his features unmistakable. It was Dr. Du Bois. Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The photograph confirmed what she already knew, but seeing the proof of his betrayal, was still a shock. He was one of them all along, she said, her voice trembling. He used me, manipulated me. Colonel Du Bois nodded, his expression grim. He was a master of deception, he said. He played his role perfectly. But he made a mistake. He underestimated you. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. You're stronger than you think, Elizabeth, he said. You've come this far. You can't give up now. He was right. She couldn't give up. She had to keep fighting for Nathaniel, for herself, for all the victims of the society's crimes. They began to gather the evidence, carefully placing the files and documents in a satchel Colonel Du Bois had brought with him. They worked quickly, silently, their movements precise and efficient. Suddenly, they heard a noise. A scraping sound coming from the passage behind them. "Someone's coming," Colonel Du Bois whispered, his hand reaching for the pistol he carried beneath his coat. They extinguished the lantern, plunging the chamber into darkness. They waited, their senses heightened, their bodies tense. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light of the outer chamber. It was Nathaniel. Elizabeth's heart leaped with joy, but it was quickly followed by a wave of fear. How had he found them? How had he gotten past the guards? "Nathaniel?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He stepped forward, into the darkness of the chamber. His face was pale, his eyes vacant, his movements stiff and unnatural. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice a monotone, devoid of emotion. Something was wrong. This wasn't the Nathaniel she knew, the Nathaniel she loved. This was the Nathaniel controlled by the society, the Nathaniel bound by the pact. "Nathaniel, it's me," Elizabeth said, stepping towards him. "It's Elizabeth. Don't you remember me?" He didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his eyes blank, his expression emotionless. Then he spoke, his voice chillingly calm. "You have something that belongs to us," he said. "Give it back." He raised his hand, and Elizabeth saw that he was holding a gun, a small, silver pistol, aimed directly at her. Colonel Du Bois stepped in front of Elizabeth, shielding her with his body. "Don't do it, Nathaniel," he said. "Fight it. You're stronger than they are." Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply tightened his grip on the gun, his finger on the trigger. Elizabeth knew what she had to do. She had to reach him, to break through the control, to remind him of who he was, of who they were. She stepped out from behind Colonel Du Bois, facing Nathaniel, her eyes locked on his. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Remember the psalm. Remember the hospital. Remember our stolen moments, our whispered promises. Remember our love." She reached out and touched his hand, the hand holding the gun. His skin was cold, almost lifeless. "Remember the letter," she said. "The letter you wrote to me. If you are reading this and I am gone, know that I will find a way back to you. Even if it takes a miracle. Even if it means crossing the boundaries of life and death." A flicker of recognition appeared in his eyes, a brief spark of the man she loved. His grip on the gun loosened slightly. "Remember the photograph," she said. "The photograph you keep changing. The photograph that brought us together. The photograph that shows you me that you are still there." His hand trembled. The gun wavered. He was fighting it, fighting the control, fighting the pact. But it wasn't enough. Suddenly, another figure appeared in the doorway. It was Dr. Du Bois, his face contorted with rage. "Kill her, Nathaniel," he shouted. "Kill them both." The spell was broken. Nathaniel's eyes cleared, his expression returning to the vacant stare. He raised the gun again, his finger tightening on the trigger. Colonel Du Bois fired his own weapon, but it jammed. Time seemed to stop. Elizabeth closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. A freedom from this nightmare, bought and paid for. Chapter 12. Shadows of the Past. A shot rang out, echoing through the confined space of the chamber. Elizabeth flinched, expecting the searing pain of a bullet, but it never came. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Nathaniel was standing there, his arm outstretched, the gun still in his hand, but he wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at Dr. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois was slumped against the wall, his hand clutching his chest, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. His eyes were wide with shock and disbelief, his mouth forming a silent O of surprise. He slid to the floor, leaving a smear of blood on the stone. Nathaniel had shot Dr. Du Bois. He had defied the control, broken the pact, chosen to protect Elizabeth instead of obeying his masters. He dropped the gun, his hand trembling, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and relief. He looked at Elizabeth, his gaze searching, questioning. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his accent thick and familiar once more. Did I?" Elizabeth rushed to him, embracing him, holding him tight. "You did it, Nathaniel," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us. You broke free." Colonel Dubois, recovering from the shock of the jammed pistol and the near-death experience, checked Dr. Dubois's pulse. He shook his head, his expression grim.
"He's gone," he said.
The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the passage. The guards, alerted by the gunshot, were coming. "We need to go," Colonel Dubois said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
They grabbed the satchel containing the evidence and fled the chamber, retracing their steps through the tunnel, back towards Notre Dame. They moved quickly, silently, their adrenaline pumping, their fear driving them forward. They reached the cathedral, emerging from the secret passage into the same crypt where they had entered. The crypt was empty, silent, the only sound their own ragged breathing. They made their way back to the main body of the cathedral, the vast space filled with the soft glow of filtered sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. The sounds of the city outside, the hum of traffic, the voices of pedestrians, seemed distant and unreal. They were safe for now, but they knew they were still in danger. The secret society would not give up. They would come after them, seeking revenge, seeking to silence them forever. As they stood there, catching their breath, Elizabeth noticed something. A small, stained glass window, tucked away in a corner of the transept, depicting a scene of a dove carrying an olive branch, a symbol of peace and hope. Beneath the window, etched into the stone, was a single word: Veritas. Truth. Elizabeth realized that the message in the Jardin du Luxembourg, a spoiler, and this new message, Veritas, were not just random words. They were part of a larger message, a clue, a guide to their next move. "Hope and truth," she said, looking at Colonel Dubois. "That's what we need. That's what we're fighting for." Colonel Dubois nodded, his expression determined.
"And we will find it," he said.
"We will expose the truth, and we will bring them to justice." But first, they needed to get out of Paris. They needed to find a safe place, a place where they could regroup, analyze the evidence, and plan their next move. Nathaniel, still shaken by what he had done, still struggling to reconcile his memories, his actions, his identity, looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Where do we go?" he asked. Elizabeth took his hand, her touch firm and reassuring. "We go home," she said. "We go to Cornwall." She knew that the journey ahead would be long and dangerous, that they would face many challenges, many obstacles. But she also knew that they were not alone. They had each other. They had the truth. And they had hope. As they left Notre Dame, stepping out into the Parisian sunlight, they carried with them the shadows of the past, the weight of their secrets, and the promise of a future they would fight for, together. The Seine flowed serenely beside them, a silent witness to their escape, reflecting the city's skyline, a skyline that hid as much as it revealed. Chapter 13. The Confession in the Rain. The journey to Cornwall was fraught with tension and uncertainty. They traveled under assumed names, using forged documents provided by Colonel Dubois, constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing the reach of the secret society. They avoided major ports and railway stations, opting for smaller, less conspicuous routes, traveling by night, hiding by day. Nathaniel, though free from the society's direct control, was still grappling with the fragmented memories and the trauma of his experiences. He was haunted by the ghosts of the war, by the actions he had committed while under the society's influence, by the near-fatal encounter in the hidden chamber. He was a shadow of his former self, his confidence shattered, his spirit wounded. Elizabeth did her best to support him, to reassure him, to help him piece together the fragments of his past. She shared her own memories of their time together, of their love, of their stolen moments, trying to rebuild the connection that had been so brutally severed. But there were moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments when the distance between them seemed insurmountable. The war had changed them both, had scarred them in ways that might never fully heal. They finally reached the Cornish coast, the rugged cliffs and crashing waves a stark contrast to the Parisian cityscape they had left behind. The air was fresh and clean, carrying the scent of salt and sea, a welcome change from the stifled atmosphere of their clandestine journey. They found refuge in a small, isolated cottage overlooking the sea, a place Nathaniel remembered from his childhood, a place he had described to Elizabeth in their whispered conversations in the field hospital. The cottage was run down and neglected, but it offered them a semblance of safety, a place to hide, a place to heal. One evening, as a storm raged outside, battering the cottage with wind and rain, Nathaniel finally broke down. He had been withdrawn and silent for days, lost in his own thoughts, his own demons. He sat by the window, watching the storm, his face illuminated by the flashes of lightning. Elizabeth sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her presence a silent offer of comfort and support. "I don't deserve you, Elizabeth," he said, his voice hoarse, his accent thick with emotion. "I don't deserve your love, your forgiveness." He recounted the horrors of the war, the things he had seen, the things he had done, the memories that haunted him day and night. He spoke of the society, of their manipulation, of their control, of the acts he had committed while under their influence. He confessed his deepest fear, that he was not the man she remembered, that he was irrevocably damaged, that he could never be the man she deserved. Elizabeth listened patiently, her heart aching for him, for the pain he was enduring, for the burden he carried. She didn't interrupt him, didn't judge him, didn't offer empty platitudes. When he had finished, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You are not defined by your past, Nathaniel," she said. "You are not defined by the things you were forced to do. You are defined by the choices you make now, by the person you choose to be." She told him that she loved him, not for who he was, but for who he is, for the man she saw beneath the scars, beneath the trauma, beneath the shadows of the past. She told him that she believed in him, that she trusted him, that she would stand by him, no matter what. "The war changed us both, Nathaniel," she said. "It scarred us in ways we may never fully understand. But it didn't break us. We survived. We found each other again. And we will face the future together." Her words, her unwavering belief in him, finally broke through the walls he had built around his heart. He turned to her, tears streaming down his face, and embraced her, holding her tight, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world. He confessed his love for her, a love that had endured through years of separation, through death and betrayal, a love that had been the driving force behind his return, a love that was stronger than any pact, any control, any force that sought to keep them apart. As the storm raged outside, they found solace in each other's arms, a refuge from the darkness, a beacon of hope in the midst of despair. They shared their fears, their doubts, their dreams, rebuilding the connection that had been shattered, forging a new bond, stronger and deeper than before. The rain beat against the window panes, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the turmoil in their hearts, but also washed away the past, cleansing them, preparing them for the challenges that lay ahead. In that small, isolated cottage, overlooking the stormy sea, they confessed their love, their fears, their hopes, and found a renewed sense of purpose, a shared determination to fight for their future, to fight for the truth, to fight for a world free from the shadows of the past. A single seagull cried overhead, its plaintive call a lonely counterpoint to the crashing waves, a symbol of both the wildness and the enduring beauty of the Cornish coast. Chapter 14. A Dance with Destiny. The following days were spent poring over the documents they had recovered from the hidden chamber. The coded language was complex, but Colonel Du Bois, with his intelligence background, was able to decipher much of it. The evidence was damning, revealing the secret society's deep involvement in orchestrating the war, manipulating governments, and profiting from the carnage. They discovered that the society, known as the Order of the Serpent's Eye, was far older and more powerful than they had imagined, with roots stretching back centuries, its tendrils reaching into the highest echelons of power across Europe. Dr. Du Bois had been just one small cog in a vast, intricate machine. Nathaniel, despite his initial reluctance, proved invaluable in deciphering the documents. His fragmented memories, triggered by familiar names and places mentioned in the files, provided crucial insights into the society's operations and its key members. He remembered details of meetings, conversations, and clandestine operations that filled in the gaps in the evidence, painting a clearer picture of the society's insidious reach. As they worked, the bond between Elizabeth and Nathaniel deepened. They shared their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, their dreams, rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of trust and shared purpose. The trauma of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined them. They were moving forward, together, stronger and more determined than ever. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, Elizabeth noticed a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner of the cottage. She had seen it before, but hadn't paid much attention to it. "What's in that box, Nathaniel?" she asked. Nathaniel looked at the box, his expression a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. It's just some old things," he said. "Belongings from my family home." He hesitated, then added, "There's a gramophone in there. And some records." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. The gramophone. The valse triste record. The memory of their stolen dance in the field hospital, the haunting melody that had accompanied their encounter with Madame Evangeline. Can we play it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes searching. He knew what she was asking, what she was seeking. A connection to the past, a reminder of their love, a symbol of their resilience. He nodded. He opened the box and carefully removed the gramophone, a beautiful, antique machine with a polished wooden case and a gleaming brass horn. He placed it on a table and selected a record from the stack. It was the valse triste. He wound the gramophone, placed the needle on the record, and the familiar melody filled the room. The melancholic strains of the waltz, a haunting echo of a forgotten time, transported them back to that dimly lit hospital tent, to that stolen moment of joy amidst the chaos of war. Elizabeth stood up and held out her hand to Nathaniel. "Dance with me," she said, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. He hadn't danced since before the war. He wasn't sure he could, but he took her hand, his touch hesitant at first, then firm and reassuring. They began to dance, slowly, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence and grace. As they danced, the memories flooded back, the pain, the loss, the fear, but also the love, the hope, the resilience. They danced through their tears, their laughter, their shared history, their intertwined destinies. The music swirled around them, a symphony of emotions, a testament to their enduring bond. They danced in the flickering firelight, the shadows dancing with them, the wind howling outside, a soundtrack to their reunion, their reconciliation, their renewed commitment to each other. They danced not just with each other, but with destiny, with the forces that had sought to tear them apart, with the ghosts of the past, with the promise of the future. They danced to reclaim their love, their lives, their freedom. As the music faded, they stood there, embracing, their hearts beating as one, their souls intertwined. They had faced their demons, confronted their past, and emerged stronger, more resilient, more in love than ever. The dance had been a catharsis, a healing, a reaffirmation of their bond. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration of their intent to fight for their future, to fight for the truth, to fight for a world free from the shadows of the secret society. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow on their faces, illuminating the love and determination in their eyes, a love and determination that would guide them through the challenges ahead. The scent of wood smoke and sea air mingled in the room, a comforting aroma that grounded them in the present, while the echoes of the waltz lingered, a reminder of the past and a promise for the future. Chapter 15. The Unsent Letter. The next morning, Colonel Dubois contacted them. He had been working tirelessly, using his remaining connections within the intelligence community to gather information and prepare for their next move. He had arranged for a clandestine meeting in London with a group of influential individuals who were sympathetic to their cause and willing to help them expose the Order of the Serpent's Eye. "It's time, Elizabeth," he said, his voice crackling over the makeshift communication device they had been using. "We need to present the evidence. We need to bring them down." The journey to London was even more perilous than their escape from Paris. The Order was undoubtedly aware of their actions, and they would be actively hunting them. They traveled in disguise, using a series of carefully planned routes and contacts, relying on the network of resistance fighters and sympathizers Colonel Du Bois had cultivated over the years. During a brief respite in a safe house, a small, unassuming farmhouse in the English countryside, Elizabeth found Nathaniel staring intently at a piece of paper. It was a letter, written in his familiar handwriting, but it wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to his brother, Thomas, who had died at Ypres in 1915. "What is that?" Elizabeth asked, her voice soft, curious. Nathaniel looked up, his expression troubled. "It's a letter I wrote before the Somme," he said. "I never sent it." He explained that he had written the letter to his brother, confiding his fears, his doubts, his premonitions of his own death. He had also written about Elizabeth, about his love for her, about his hopes for a future together. "I wanted him to know," Nathaniel said, his voice choked with emotion. "I wanted him to know about you, about us. In case I didn't make it back." Elizabeth sat beside him, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had carried, for the burden of his unspoken words. She took the letter from his hand and began to read. The letter was a window into Nathaniel's soul, a glimpse into the heart of the man she loved. He wrote of his love for his brother, of his grief over his death, of his guilt at surviving when so many others had perished. He wrote of the horrors of the war, of the senseless slaughter, of the loss of innocence. And he wrote of Elizabeth, of his love for her, of the light she had brought into his darkness, of the hope she had given him. He described her beauty, her kindness, her strength, her unwavering belief in him. As Elizabeth read the letter, tears streamed down her face. It was a testament to their love, a love that had transcended death, a love that had survived the ravages of war, a love that had defied the machinations of a secret society. But there was something else in the letter, something that caught Elizabeth's attention. Nathaniel had written about a recurring dream, a dream of being trapped in a dark, underground chamber, of being surrounded by shadowy figures, of hearing a voice whispering his name. It was the same dream he had described to Madame Evangeline, the dream that had revealed the symbol of the Order of the Serpent's Eye. But in this letter, he described something more. He wrote of a specific detail, a detail he hadn't mentioned before. He wrote of a hidden inscription on the wall of the chamber, an inscription that read, "The eye sees all, but the heart knows the truth." Elizabeth's mind raced. The inscription. It was another clue, another piece of the puzzle. It was a message, a guide, a key to understanding the Order's secrets. She looked at Nathaniel, her eyes filled with a newfound understanding. "This inscription, Nathaniel," she said. "It's important. It's connected to the Order, to their beliefs, to their power." Nathaniel looked at her, his expression puzzled. "I don't understand," he said. "What does it mean?" Elizabeth explained her theory, that the inscription was a reference to the Order's control over information, their ability to manipulate events, their belief in their own omniscience. But it also contained a hidden message, a message of hope, a message of resistance. "The eye sees all," she said, refers to their surveillance, their control, their power. "But the heart knows the truth. That's the key. That's our strength. That's what they can't control. Our love, our compassion, our belief in what is right." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes widening in understanding. "The heart," he said. "It's the one thing they can't control. It's the one thing that can defeat them." The unsent letter, a message from the past, had given them a new weapon, a new understanding, a new hope. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of overwhelming power, the human heart, the capacity for love, for compassion, for truth, could prevail. The farmhouse was quiet, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fire in the hearth, a comforting warmth in the face of the dangers that lay ahead. The letter, a fragile piece of paper, lay between them, a testament to love, loss, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Chapter 16. The Truth Behind the Eyes. The meeting in London took place in a discreet, unmarked building in the heart of Mayfair. The room was filled with a diverse group of individuals, politicians, journalists, former intelligence officers, and wealthy philanthropists, all united by a shared concern about the growing influence of the Order of the Serpent's Eye and a commitment to exposing their crimes. Colonel Du Bois presented the evidence they had gathered, detailing the Order's involvement in the war, their manipulation of governments, their war profiteering. He spoke with passion and conviction, his words carrying the weight of years of investigation and a deep sense of personal betrayal. Elizabeth and Nathaniel also spoke, sharing their personal experiences, their encounters with the Order, their struggles to break free from its control. Nathaniel's testimony, in particular, was powerful and moving. He spoke of his fragmented memories, of the horrors he had witnessed, of the acts he had committed while under the Order's influence, and of his eventual redemption. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies compelling. The attendees were shocked, outraged, and galvanized into action. They agreed to form a coalition, to pool their resources, to launch a coordinated campaign to expose the Order and bring its members to justice. But there was one attendee who remained skeptical. Lord Ashworth, a powerful and influential member of the British aristocracy, questioned the validity of the evidence, dismissing it as circumstantial, unreliable, and based on the testimony of a traumatized soldier and a grieving nurse. He challenged Nathaniel directly, questioning his sanity, his motives, his credibility. He accused him of being a pawn of foreign powers, of seeking to destabilize the government, of undermining the established order. Nathaniel, still struggling with his self-doubt, still haunted by the ghosts of the past, began to falter under Ashworth's relentless interrogation. He stumbled over his words, his confidence wavering, his memories becoming confused and fragmented. Elizabeth saw what was happening. She saw Ashworth's manipulation, his attempt to discredit Nathaniel, to undermine their efforts, to protect the Order. She knew she had to intervene, to defend Nathaniel, to expose Ashworth's true allegiance. She stood up, her voice clear and strong, her eyes blazing with anger. "Lord Ashworth," she said, "you question Nathaniel's sanity, his motives, his credibility. But I question yours." She turned to the other attendees, her gaze sweeping the room. "Lord Ashworth is not who he seems," she said. "He is not a disinterested observer. He is a member of the Order of the Serpent's Eye." A gasp went through the room. Ashworth's face paled, his composure shattering. He tried to deny it, to bluster his way out of it, but Elizabeth was prepared. She presented the evidence she had gathered, piecing together fragments of information from the documents, from Nathaniel's memories, from her own observations. She revealed Ashworth's connections to known members of the Order, his financial dealings, his political machinations. And then, she played her final card. She revealed the meaning of the inscription. The eye sees all, but the heart knows the truth, explaining its significance, its connection to the Order's beliefs, its hidden message of hope and resistance. She explained that Ashworth's relentless questioning of Nathaniel, his attempt to discredit him, was not about seeking the truth, but about protecting the Order, about concealing their crimes. He was trying to control the narrative, to manipulate the perception of reality, to blind them to the truth. But the heart, Elizabeth said, knows the truth. The heart cannot be deceived. The heart recognizes love, compassion, courage, and resilience. And the heart, she said, pointing to Nathaniel, recognizes the truth in his eyes. Nathaniel, emboldened by Elizabeth's words, by her unwavering belief in him, stood tall, his eyes clear and steady, his voice firm and resolute. He met Ashworth's gaze unflinchingly and spoke the truth, his truth, the truth of his experiences, the truth of his love for Elizabeth, the truth of his commitment to exposing the Order. The attendees were convinced. They saw the truth in Nathaniel's eyes, the truth in Elizabeth's words, the truth in the evidence before them. Ashworth's deception was exposed, his power broken. The coalition was formed. The campaign to expose the order was launched. The tide had turned. As they left the meeting, Elizabeth and Nathaniel walked hand in hand, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief, hope, and determination. They had faced their greatest challenge yet, and they had prevailed. They had exposed the truth, not just about the order, but about themselves, about their love, about their strength. The London fog swirled around them, but it no longer felt menacing, no longer a symbol of concealment and deception. It felt like a shroud being lifted, revealing a path forward, a path towards justice, a path towards a future free from the shadows of the past. The distant chimes of Big Ben rang out, a symbol of hope and resilience, a call to action, a promise of a new dawn. Chapter 17. Flight from the Palais Royal. The exposure of Lord Ashworth sent shockwaves through the Order of the Serpent's Eye. Their carefully constructed facade of respectability and influence began to crumble. Public outrage grew, fueled by the revelations of their war profiteering and their manipulation of governments. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and the once untouchable members of the Order found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. But the Order was not defeated yet. They still had powerful allies, hidden resources, and a ruthless determination to survive. They launched a counteroffensive, using their influence in the media to discredit Elizabeth, Nathaniel, and Colonel Du Bois, portraying them as delusional fanatics, dangerous radicals, and enemies of the state. They also targeted them directly. Elizabeth and Nathaniel were forced to go into hiding again, moving from safe house to safe house, constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing assassination or abduction. One evening, while they were staying in a small, hidden apartment near the Palais Royal, they received a coded message from Colonel Du Bois. He had discovered the location of the Order's headquarters, a secret chamber hidden beneath the Palais Royal itself, a place where they held their meetings, planned their operations, and stored their most valuable secrets. "This is our chance, Elizabeth," Colonel Du Bois said, his voice urgent over the communication device. "We need to infiltrate their headquarters. We need to gather the final piece of evidence, the proof that will destroy them once and for all." The plan was risky, almost suicidal. The Palais Royal was heavily guarded, and the Order would be on high alert, expecting an attack. But they knew it was their only chance to end the threat, to secure their future, to finally bring the Order to justice. They prepared meticulously, studying the blueprints of the Palais Royal, identifying potential entry points, planning their escape routes. Nathaniel, drawing on his fragmented memories of his time with the Order, provided crucial insights into their security protocols and their methods of operation. Under the cover of darkness, they made their way to the Palais Royal. The streets were deserted, the city holding its breath, the silence broken only by the occasional patrol car and the distant sound of sirens. They bypassed the main entrance, opting for a less conspicuous route, a narrow alleyway that led to a forgotten service entrance. They slipped past the guards, using a combination of stealth, deception, and Colonel Du Bois's expertise in covert operations. They found themselves in a maze of corridors and chambers, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The Palais Royal, once a symbol of royal power and opulence, now felt like a tomb, a repository of secrets and lies. Nathaniel, guided by his fragmented memories, led them through the labyrinth, his instincts honed by his time with the Order, his steps sure and confident. They reached a seemingly ordinary wall, a section of paneling that concealed the entrance to the Order's secret chamber. Nathaniel pressed a hidden button, and with a grinding sound, the paneling slid open, revealing a dark, narrow passage. They entered the passage, their hearts pounding, their senses heightened. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, the sense of danger palpable. They reached the chamber, a large, circular room, dimly lit by flickering torches. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with ancient tomes and arcane texts. In the center of the room, there was a large, stone table, covered in maps, charts, and documents. This was the heart of the Order, the place where they plotted their schemes, planned their wars, and controlled their vast empire of influence. They began to search the chamber, carefully examining the documents, looking for the final piece of evidence, the proof that would expose their ultimate goal, their long-term plan for global domination. Suddenly, they heard a noise. A door slamming shut. Footsteps approaching. They were trapped. The Order had discovered them. They were surrounded. There was no escape. As the footsteps drew closer, Elizabeth and Nathaniel braced themselves for the inevitable confrontation, their hands clasped together, their love a shield against the darkness that surrounded them. The torches flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere, a stage set for a final, desperate act. The scent of old paper and incense mingled with the metallic tang of fear, a potent cocktail that heightened their senses, sharpened their awareness of the impending danger. Chapter 18. The Heart's True North. The door to the chamber burst open, and a group of men, dressed in the black uniforms of the Order's elite guard, stormed in, their weapons drawn. Leading them was a figure Elizabeth recognized instantly, the head of the Order, a man known only as the Serpent. He was an older man, tall and imposing, with a cold, cruel face and piercing eyes that seemed to see through everything. He exuded an aura of power and menace, a chilling embodiment of the Order's ruthless ambition. "So," the Serpent said, his voice a low, venomous hiss, "the prodigal son returns. And he brings his little pet with him." He looked at Nathaniel with disdain, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You were supposed to be one of us, Nathaniel," he said. "You were destined for greatness. But you chose to betray us. You chose love over power." Nathaniel stood tall, his gaze unwavering, his voice firm and resolute. "I chose freedom," he said.
Ich chose truth.
"I chose love." The Serpent sneered. "Foolish sentiment," he said. "Love is a weakness. Truth is an illusion. Only power matters." He turned to Elizabeth, his eyes narrowing. "And you," he said, "the meddling nurse. You have interfered with our plans for too long. You have caused us considerable inconvenience." He signaled to his guards. "Take them," he ordered. "And this time, make sure they don't escape." The guards advanced, their weapons trained on Elizabeth and Nathaniel. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped. There was no way out. But Elizabeth refused to give up. She had come too far, faced too much, lost too much to surrender now. She looked at Nathaniel, her eyes filled with love and determination. "We fight," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We fight for our love, for our freedom, for our future." Nathaniel nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. He had been a soldier, a warrior, a killer. He had been controlled, manipulated, broken. But he was also a lover, a protector, a survivor. He would fight. They charged towards the guards, a desperate act of defiance, a final stand against the overwhelming power of the Order. They fought with courage and ferocity, fueled by their love, their rage, their determination to survive. But it was a hopeless fight. They were quickly overpowered, disarmed, and subdued. The Serpent watched them, his expression cold and impassive, as they were dragged before him, bruised and bleeding, their bodies aching, their spirits unbroken. "You cannot win," he said. "The Order is too powerful. Our reach is too vast. Our destiny is inevitable." He raised his hand, and one of the guards brought forward a small, silver box. It was the same box Elizabeth had seen in the cottage in Cornwall, the box that contained the gramophone and the valse triste record. The Serpent opened the box, revealing the record inside. He held it up, his eyes gleaming with a cruel, triumphant light. "This," he said, "is your weakness. This sentimental attachment to the past. This love." He smashed the record against the stone table, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The sound echoed through the chamber, a symbolic destruction of their love, their hope, their future. Elizabeth gasped, her heart breaking at the sight of the shattered record, the symbol of their stolen moments, their whispered promises, their enduring bond. But then, something unexpected happened. As the fragments of the record scattered across the floor, a hidden compartment in the box was revealed. Inside, there was a small, rolled-up piece of paper. Nathaniel recognized it instantly. It was a photograph. A photograph of the members of the Order, taken at a secret meeting years ago. And in the photograph, clearly visible, was the serpent himself, standing beside a young, idealistic Nathaniel Blackwood. And also, another man, the face of the actual Dr. Du Bois, the man who had been replaced. The photograph was the final piece of evidence, the proof of the serpent's identity, the proof of his involvement in the Order's crimes, the proof that would destroy him and his organization. The serpent stared at the photograph, his face paling, his composure shattering. He had been so focused on destroying their love, their hope, that he had forgotten about the hidden evidence, the secret he had thought was safely concealed. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel, her eyes shining with triumph. "The heart knows the truth," she said, echoing the inscription from the dream. "And the truth always finds a way." The serpent had been defeated, not by force, not by power, but by love, by memory, by the enduring strength of the human heart. His own arrogance and cruelty led to the discovery. The heart, it turned out, was also a compass, pointing true north. Chapter 19. A Dawn of Reckoning. The discovery of the photograph sent the chamber into chaos. The guards, realizing their leader's deception and the imminent collapse of their order, hesitated, their loyalty wavering. Colonel Du Bois, who had managed to slip away during the initial confrontation and alert his allies, arrived with reinforcements, a combined force of British and French intelligence agents. A fierce firefight erupted, the sound of gunfire and shouting echoing through the secret chamber. But the tide had turned. The Order's forces, demoralized and betrayed, were quickly overwhelmed. The serpent, seeing his empire crumbling around him, attempted to flee, but Nathaniel, fueled by a righteous anger and a desire for justice, intercepted him. They fought, a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle, a clash of wills, a reckoning for years of manipulation and betrayal. Nathaniel, despite his injuries, fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, his every blow fueled by the memory of the war, the loss of his comrades, the violation of his soul, and the threat to his beloved Elizabeth. He disarmed the serpent, forcing him to his knees. He had him at his mercy, the man who had orchestrated his suffering, the man who had tried to destroy his love, the man who had embodied the darkness that had haunted his life. But Nathaniel did not kill him. He had seen enough death, enough violence, enough suffering. He would not become the monster he was fighting. He looked at the serpent, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. "It's over," he said, his voice cold and resolute. "You're finished." The serpent was taken into custody, along with the remaining members of the Order. The evidence gathered from the chamber, combined with the photograph and the testimonies of Elizabeth, Nathaniel, and Colonel Du Bois, was irrefutable. The Order of the Serpent's eye was exposed, its crimes revealed, its power shattered. The world learned of their manipulation of governments, their orchestration of wars, their ruthless pursuit of global domination. The revelations sparked outrage and condemnation, leading to widespread arrests, trials, and the dismantling of their vast network of influence. Elizabeth and Nathaniel, hailed as heroes, were finally free. Free from the Order, free from the shadows of the past, free to live their lives, to love each other, to build a future together. They returned to Cornwall, to the small, isolated cottage overlooking the sea, the place where their love had been rekindled, the place where they had found the strength to fight back. They stood on the cliffs, the wind whipping their hair, the waves crashing against the rocks below. The storm had passed, the sky was clear, the sun shining brightly. Nathaniel took Elizabeth's hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and wonder. "We defeated them." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "We did it together," she said. "We found our way back to each other. We found our way back to the light." They embraced, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a symbol of resilience and triumph over adversity. They had faced their demons, confronted their past, and emerged stronger, more in love than ever. As they stood there, gazing out at the vast expanse of the sea, they knew that their journey was not over. They would always carry the scars of the war, the memories of their struggles, the knowledge of the darkness that lurked in the world. But they also knew that they had each other, that their love was a force that could conquer anything, that they could face any challenge, overcome any obstacle, as long as they stood together. The sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and purple, a breathtaking display of beauty and serenity. A new dawn was breaking, a dawn of reckoning, a dawn of hope, a dawn of a future filled with love, peace, and the promise of a world free from the shadows of the past. A single seagull flew overhead, its call now sounding like a triumphant cry, a celebration of freedom and a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. Chapter 20. The Reunion at Gare du Nord. Years passed. The wounds of war slowly healed, but the scars remained, a reminder of the battles fought, the losses endured, the price of freedom. Elizabeth and Nathaniel built a life together in Cornwall, a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of everyday existence. They restored the old cottage, turning it into a haven, a sanctuary, a place where they could heal and rebuild. Nathaniel, though still haunted by the ghosts of the past, found peace in the simple rhythms of country life. He worked the land, tending to the gardens, fishing in the sea, finding solace in the connection to nature, in the tangible results of his labor. He rediscovered the man he had been before the war, the man Elizabeth had fallen in love with, the man he had always strived to be. Elizabeth continued her work as a translator, using her skills to help others, to bridge cultural divides, to promote understanding and peace. She became a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for the wounded and the traumatized, a champion of reconciliation and healing. They never forgot their experiences, their struggles, their triumphs. They remained vigilant, aware of the darkness that still lurked in the world, committed to fighting for justice, for truth, for a better future. One day, a letter arrived. It was from Colonel Du Bois, now retired and living in Paris. He wrote of a ceremony, a dedication of a memorial at Gare du Nord, honoring the nurses and soldiers who had served during the war, a tribute to their courage, their sacrifice, their resilience. He invited Elizabeth and Nathaniel to attend, to be recognized for their contributions, to share their story, to inspire others. They hesitated at first. Returning to Paris, to the scene of their struggles, their traumas, their triumphs, was a daunting prospect. But they knew they had to go. They had to honor the memory of those who had fallen, to celebrate the resilience of the human spirit, to show the world that even in the darkest of times, hope and love could prevail. They traveled to Paris, the city that held so many memories, so many ghosts, so much pain, but also so much hope. The city had changed, rebuilt, revitalized, but the scars of war were still visible, etched into the stones, whispered in the wind, reflected in the eyes of its people. They arrived at Gare du Nord, the bustling railway station that had been a gateway to the front lines, a place of farewells and reunions, a symbol of hope and despair. The station was crowded, filled with people from all walks of life, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and remembrance. The ceremony was moving, poignant, and cathartic. Speeches were made, songs were sung, tears were shed. The names of the fallen were read aloud, their memory honored, their sacrifice acknowledged. Elizabeth and Nathaniel were called to the stage, their story shared with the assembled crowd. They spoke of their experiences, of their love, of their struggles, of their triumphs. They spoke of the horrors of war, of the importance of peace, of the enduring power of the human spirit. As they spoke, Elizabeth noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was a woman, elderly but still vibrant, her eyes filled with a knowing wisdom. It was Madame Evangeline, the spiritualist from Montmartre, the woman who had helped them understand the mysteries of Nathaniel's return, the woman who had warned them of the dangers they faced. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. They had both played a part in the unfolding drama, a small but significant role in the fight against the darkness. After the ceremony, Elizabeth and Nathaniel approached Madame Evangeline. They thanked her for her help, for her guidance, for her courage. "The veil is thin," Madame Evangeline said, her voice a low, melodious hum. "But it is lifting. The light is returning." She smiled, a knowing, enigmatic smile. "The spirits are at peace," she said. "And so, I believe, are you?" As they walked away from Gare du Nord, hand in hand, Elizabeth and Nathaniel felt a sense of closure, a sense of completion, a sense of peace. They had come full circle, returning to the place where their journey had begun, the place where their love had been tested, the place where they had found their way back to each other. The Parisian sun shone brightly, illuminating the city, casting a warm glow on their faces. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. They had fought for their love, for their freedom, for their future, and they had won. They stopped on a bridge overlooking the Seine, the river flowing serenely beneath them, carrying the memories of the past, flowing towards the promise of the future. They embraced, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a symbol of resilience and triumph over adversity. The city spread out before them, a tapestry of life, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. Epilogue. The years that followed were kind to Elizabeth and Nathaniel. They lived a quiet, contented life in Cornwall, surrounded by the beauty of the sea and the warmth of their enduring love. They had children and then grandchildren, filling their home with laughter and the joyful chaos of family life. Nathaniel's nightmares eventually faded, replaced by dreams of peace and contentment. He found solace in working the land, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the simple pleasures of life. He never forgot the war or the horrors he had witnessed, but he no longer let them define him. He had found redemption, forgiveness, and a profound sense of inner peace. Elizabeth continued her work, advocating for peace and understanding, using her voice to heal and to inspire. She became a respected figure in her community, a symbol of resilience, courage, and compassion. She never forgot the darkness they had faced, the forces they had fought, the love that had sustained them. They often spoke of their experiences, sharing their story with their children and grandchildren, teaching them the importance of courage, of compassion, of standing up for what is right, of fighting for a better world. One day, many years later, Elizabeth found herself alone in the cottage. Nathaniel had passed away peacefully in his sleep a few years earlier, his hand clasped in hers, his final breath a sigh of contentment. She missed him terribly, but she carried his love within her heart, a constant source of strength and comfort. She walked into their bedroom, the room where their journey had begun, the room where the photograph had refused to stay the same. She looked at the nightstand, where the photograph had once resided. It was no longer there. They had decided, years ago, to put it away, to let go of the past, to embrace the future. But as she stood there, gazing at the empty space, she felt a familiar presence, a warmth, a sense of love that transcended time and space. She closed her eyes, and she could almost see him, standing there, smiling at her, his eyes filled with the same love and devotion she remembered so vividly. She reached out, her hand touching the empty space where the photograph had once been. And for a fleeting moment, she felt it, the warmth of his hand, the touch of his skin, the whisper of his voice. Elizabeth, she opened her eyes, and the presence was gone. But the feeling remained, the certainty that he was still with her, in spirit, in memory, in the love that would endure forever. She smiled, a tear rolling down her cheek. She was not alone. She would never be alone. Their love was a bond that could never be broken, a light that would never fade, a story that would be told for generations to come. She walked out of the cottage, into the sunlight, the sea breeze gently caressing her face. The Cornish coast stretched out before her, vast and beautiful, a timeless landscape that had witnessed their struggles, their triumphs, their enduring love. She looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of the sea, at the promise of a new day. And she knew that their story, their love, their legacy, would live on, a testament to the power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world that still needed light, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love could prevail. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs was a constant, reassuring presence, a symphony of nature, a song of eternity. The end.